Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 7th episode of the Overly Sarcastic podcast. I'm your host, Blue. That hasn't changed. Special episode of the podcast today because it is, if I upload this on the right day, it is July 4th, which is America's Independence Day, which we now celebrate somewhat ironically right next to Britain's sort of, hopefully not, Independence Day. But anyway, this is going to be an episode all about American democracy, and specifically the social contract theorists and the mind that shaped our government. And also because my girlfriend kind of has a test on this stuff next week, so let's jump in. Now, a bit of a historical background on democracy. There were only really two democracies, well, major democracies before America, and that was Athens, of course. Athens was kind of the big one. They kind of invented the thing. And then after that, the first modern experiment in democracy in between a couple of republics that were sort of democratic, sort of not, were pirates in the Republic of Pirates in Nassau. And that kind of floundered for various reasons, but the next big democracy to come out in the modern world was America. And the people behind it were mostly Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and a little bit of Hume. So I'm going to go and talk through what they said and why it's important and how it kind of relates to the American government we now know and love. Unless you know and hate it, but I don't judge, whatever. So, now the earliest one we have is Hobbes, and he was born around the time of the English Civil War, which is one of the most turbulent periods in British history. If you want to know more, you can check out Historical Models 3 Revolutions, but skipping the details, Hobbes was coming out of a place where everything was a mess, and it was turbulent and impossible to really figure anything out. So a lot of his policy advice is geared towards stability, and we will see that as we go through his main work, The Leviathan. So the point of The Leviathan is to lay out a method of governance and social policy that comes from a place of mathematics and science. So he structures it as a mathematical proof, which is quite interesting because you really don't see a lot of social science being treated as a science like that in the form of a logical proof until, people like Hobbes. So what he starts off by saying is that humans are by nature solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's his motto. If you talk to anyone who knows about Hobbes, they'll say, what do you think of Hobbes? They'll say solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's, the go-to way to describe Hobbes. So he thinks that humans are terrible and it's just a giant Hunger Games when everyone's left to their own devices without government. So his outlook on humanity in its so-called state of nature is not very good. But he says when humans decide to voluntarily enter into a form of government in which they can, interact in a more pleasant way with each other instead of trying to steal things and kill each other and worry about having things stolen from you and being killed, everything settles down a lot more. So he said there are a couple different types of governments that you can use. You can do, democracies, republics, oligarchies, whatnot. But he says the best way to have a government under a social contract is a king. Because with one king in charge, assuming that everyone acts rationally, which is a big assumption he makes, which a lot of people fault him for, the king will do everything in their power to make sure everything runs smoothly for everybody, because then, if the king's subjects are happy, the king will be happy because no one will be revolting against him. Now, this would be well and good if people were rational, but as we all know, they really aren't. And if you look especially at Plato's Republic, when he talks about tyrants, he sees how people can be very irrational when they have tons of power. So Hobbes' main idea is people are terrible. If we have a king, we can keep all in check. Everyone will be in one government, working together and not stealing from each other. Because if we have a governing body that can exact justice upon people who do things, that are wrong, well, life goes on, things are well. So that's, the super condensed version of Hobbes. Locke is much more in the middle between the spectrum of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. So Locke believes that in the state of nature, humans are inherently kind of They're not necessarily good or bad by design. Everyone's pretty much free and equal under the eyes of nature because no one really has anything above anyone else besides their physical attributes and mental prowess. So he says that in state of nature, life is okay because, people have their own things and sometimes people steal from you, but you have the right as a person who exists to get your stuff back because everyone has the right to property, which we'll come back to later. He says that the thing is, this works, it's okay. A Lockean state of nature is basically a kind of look over your shoulder to make sure no one's stealing your stuff and hope that you're not getting stabbed-a-thon, but he doesn't think that people are really prone to do that, but he acknowledges that it happens. Locke's big thing is property, and he believes that everyone has a right to property, and the best way to preserve that is instead of it being a free-for-all where everyone will have their own stuff, some people will take it, some people will exact revenge to get their things back, we have a government put in place and everyone agrees to be part of a society where everyone follows the rules, and if someone breaks the rules, it's the government that will take things back, give them to people, put people in jail, do all those necessary justice-y things, so the people can instead worry about living their lives and not have to think about, how am I going to get my stuff back? That the government is there as a safety net to take care of those things for you. So he thinks that government is a good thing. He believes that, unlike Hobbes, that thinks, monarchies are not the best way to go about things. He thinks that representative republics are good, for instance, democracies, all those kinds of things, the more votey type governments that we're more used to. So Locke thinks that the task of government is best suited to taking care of people's personal belongings and making sure that when something bad happens to someone or their property, instead of them having to worry about getting it back and exacting justice on the person who wronged them, that the government can do that for them and people can worry about living their own lives instead of having to look over their shoulder all the time and keep track of their stuff, and then if something bad happens, them having to do everything themselves. So you can see echoes of this in the Declaration of Independence when the Patriots talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea comes from Locke. Originally, that line was the pursuit of property, but to make it sound a little bit nicer, and because they knew people later would be reading it in school, they decided to change it to the pursuit of happiness. So Locke thinks that King George did a really terrible job of looking over the colonies because he denied the people there their natural rights, meaning that he instituted taxes that were too high and allowed soldiers to quarter in random people's houses, which was a no-no. So Locke would obviously be on the side of the colonists in this case by thinking, hey, the government isn't doing its rightful job, we have the responsibility to do that ourselves, therefore boom, everyone agrees to unite under new government, social contract, Declaration of Independence, blah blah blah, Revolutionary War, rest of American history, you know the drill. So the sort of last guy on our list here is Rousseau, and his deal is that people are by nature equal, and the state of nature is really, really good because everyone is nice and people aren't corrupted by wants of power or money. Everyone just has themselves and it's fine. It's like a giant picnic, more or less. And if you've heard of the phrase noble savage, that's often attributed to Rousseau's human in the state of nature. They just kind of do their own thing. So Rousseau's deal is that he thinks that people are best suited to live in a state of nature, unlike Locke and Hobbes, because Rousseau thinks that everyone by nature is really nice, and that it's things like society that make people angry and mean and murdery. So everyone is equal in the state of nature because no one has any possessions. The moment anyone takes a possession and calls it their own, it creates inequality, and then it creates hatred between people. So Rousseau's most famous line is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." This gets back to the idea that he has in the state of nature that man is born free in the state of nature, but because of society, he is in chains to his own wants for property, or people who are oppressing him by having other things and stuff like that. So from Rousseau, you get a lot of desire to go back to the state of nature and to get rid of government, making it as limited as possible. So Rousseau's big deal is that he wants government to be a thing that makes people equal. So in things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, when you get stuff like, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that comes from Rousseau and his desire to fight the impulse of society that is to make people unequal by making people legally equal in the eyes of the law and of government. So the way government is maintained in a way that works in the best interest of the people is through the general will. Now this basically means majority rule, so that when everyone in a group says, we want to do this, we do this. When most people in the group say we want to do this, we still do this because that's what the general will of the people is. Later on, the social scientist Alexis de Tocqueville would describe this as the tyranny of the majority, but for now, it's the general will because everything's nice and good. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about Hume, who combined some elements of Rousseau and Locke. So Hume was also very big on property, in that he said that the government cannot take the property of the people in any case, which kind of plays into the whole, Revolutionary War thing. Hume agrees with Rousseau in that he thinks that humans are naturally born free. However, he thinks that a good government can preserve the rights of the people if, following with what I just said about him relating to Locke, if it makes sure that people's properties are respected. So hopefully you see how that all kind of plays together, and a lot of those ideas that were kind of floating around in the late Renaissance through the Enlightenment play into what became the American government. Now, before we go, just one last thing. If you walk around Washington, D.C., you'll see a bunch of vaguely Roman, Greek-looking buildings that would make you think that the form of government that America has is based off of the Romans and the Greeks. This isn't really true because we don't have a direct democracy, nor do we have an emperor, nor do we have consuls. So our government doesn't fit that of the Greeks or the Romans really in very many ways at all. Because if you look at American government, what you see is a bunch of small states and governments under a federal body. And the only other place you really see that is in the Iroquois Confederation, which is why originally the government of the United States was designed by the Articles of Confederation. You can see some of those influences from Native American government sticking around, which would make sense because that was the government they were most familiar with, being that they lived in the area with them. So while that didn't end up staying when we instituted the Constitution, the fact that we have a federal government overlooking small, fairly autonomous states is a big red arrow pointing to the fact that although America probably wouldn't like to admit it given their history with Native Americans, the original colonists who drafted up our form of government, signed the Declaration of Independence, and fought the Revolutionary War were borrowing a lot of ideas from the Native American government, which I would say turned out pretty well because if you look at American government, it is the only system of its kind in the world. I mean, a federal body overlooking smaller independent states, you really don't see that all that often, which is why I think it's really cool. America likes to say it's a melting pot, and whether or not that's actually true, one of the ways that is true is the way in which America went around picking its form of government from various sources. So with that all said, I hope you enjoyed that, maybe learned something possibly, feel a little bit more patriotic or less, as the case may be, who knows. But either way, enjoy the 4th of July weekend. Pip, pip, cheerio. Well, actually fought a war, so we wouldn't be saying that. But either way, have a lovely day, and I will see you on the next episode of the Overly Sarcastic Podcast. Bye-bye.